You're listening to episode 164 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Sebene Selassie, Executive Director of New York Insight Meditation Center, joins us to speak about organizational models in contemporary Western Sanghas. Times change. We're not in Deer Park or Vulture's Peak 2,500 years ago. We're in Central Park and Pikes Peak in the 21st century. What people do, what we think, how we relate to one another, our societal constructs have evolved, and the ways in which our institutions reflect the needs of the people they serve are evolving too. Sebene Selassie received a BA from McGill University, where she majored in comparative religious studies and minored in women's studies, and received an MA in media studies from the New School. For 20 years, she has worked with children, youth, families in underserved communities as a coordinator, manager, and director of social service and arts programs. She specializes in youth development and youth media. Sebene has worked as a consultant, combining social change leadership and mindfulness practices, including building inclusive communities, creating learner-centered curricula, leading social action arts workshops, and teaching meditation. She is a graduate of the Community Dharma Leaders Program at Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Woodacre, California, and is a current student of the Professional Coaching Course Training Program at New Ventures West. So sit back, relax, and have a nice McNulty's Nectar. And our guest today is Sebene Selassie. Sebene, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
Very glad to be speaking with you, and I wanted to have a special thanks to our friend Doug Smith for suggesting this, and to one of the particular threads we have on the SBA site that was asking about larger organizations and how they do what they do. So thanks so much for being here to talk about that. Let's get started by having you tell us a bit about your background.
I was born in Ethiopia, grew up in Washington, D.C. with a lot of other Ethiopians. There's a large immigrant community there. And I came to the Dharma pretty early. I majored in comparative religious studies in my undergraduate in the late 80s. I graduated in 92 with a focus in early Buddhism. And I started working in nonprofits almost right out of college, working mostly in after-school education, in community-based organizations, and also arts organizations, and then got into youth development a couple of years after that, and worked pretty much in youth development and youth media and other sort of nonprofits geared towards young people, almost until I started working now as executive director of New York Insight. So I like to say that, my role now is kind of a combination of my undergraduate training and my many years of Dharma study and practice, and then my professional life as a nonprofit manager.
So how did you get started with meditation and Buddhist practice? Where did that first crop up?
I came to the Dharma like many people, or like a lot of people I've met, sort of intellectually first and academically. So I was reading a lot, and I didn't start practicing it actually until after school. So I think I first started sitting in about 93 93 or 94 at the Zen Center in San Francisco, and not for very long. I didn't last in in that tradition very long, and I started picking up sitting again when I moved to New York in the mid 90s, and I sat mostly with Barry Magid, Ordinary Mind School, Charlotte Joko Beck's school, the Charlotte Joko Beck. And practiced and studied with Barry for a few years. And then, sort of early 2000, I spent some time in Thailand and Southeast Asia and practiced a bit there, mostly at Wat Suan Muk, which is Ajahn Buddhadasa's temple and retreat center. And then I came back to the States. I was living in Africa, West Africa, working in emergency work in refugee camps for a couple of years. And when I came back to the States, I moved to DC, and there was no Ordinary Mind teacher there. And so I started sitting with the Insight meditation community of Washington with Tara Brach and some of the outlying Kalyana Mitta groups and Sanghas. And that's how I came to Insight. And so when I moved back to New York in 2006, I started sitting at New York Insight and became very involved here.
Okay. So I'm kind of curious because having had a very similar background with starting in Zen and kind of migrating over towards more Theravada practices, I was wondering if there was anything that stood out to you as distinguishing characteristics between Zen and Insight, and why you're more inclined, at least at this point in your life, towards Insight.
For me, it's been largely about the teachers and the teachers who've spoken most directly to me in the moment in my life. I've generally, and I think one of the reasons why I didn't last at San Francisco Zen Center, even though it's an amazing community and I have good friends who practice there, I was definitely drawn to kind of the more secularized, more Western Buddhist traditions. So in the Ordinary Mind School, there are no robes and no titles, and they don't even have altars per se. I was definitely more drawn to kind of traditions that didn't carry over some of the cultural traditions from Asia as much. And there are many people, and I respect that are attracted to that, and it really resonates for them. But no one Asian tradition really resonated for me that strongly. So I was looking for something that, didn't necessarily bring all of and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but the trappings with them when the practice was translated to the West. So it was interesting when I came back to New York. I had all intentions to go to Barry's new Zendo on the Upper West Side, but I sort of just landed at New York Insight. It was a couple of blocks from my job, and then I quickly built Sangha here. There's a very large people of color sitting here, and I'd never actually sat in a POC group until I got to DC, which is a small one, and that really was powerful for me. Something that, for years I've said that I was the only person of color in the room besides the Buddha. And
it's interesting. We just this weekend, as we're recording this, put out the interview with Tuere Sala about people of color, sanghas, and community. And this is a follow-up to some other conversations that we've had about that in the past with others. So it's good to see that there's a little more traction about this. And for folks who are listening who, like me, fit into a particular demographic of Caucasian, middle class, Midwesterners, for example, who think, oh, that isn't really something I'm concerned about. It's not really my issue. Do consider a broader perspective of what we mean by community, that this is for all people, and that inclusivity, and I'm looking forward to talking about that a little bit later in this interview, is one of the hallmarks, as I see it, of a more secularized practice, and that it is open to more people.
Yeah, definitely. So coming into practice at New York Insight, it was just a very powerful homecoming in a way, because I for years also said I didn't have any Buddhist friends. I was also one of the younger people in most of the sanghas that I practiced with, and So it was just it just felt like home. So it wasn't so much a doctrinal issue or even stylistic that I chose insight in the Theravadan tradition. I think it was convenience and feeling of community and connection, really.
Hmm. Good. So shifting a little over towards the organizational stuff, you've described yourself as an organizational nerd. What is it that interests you about that, an organization building?
I think that I'm going to talk about it sort of in reverse, but I've noticed a tendency, even heard some pretty harsh remarks about organizations since I've been working in them, but particularly since I started working more closely with New York Insight, first as a board member for many years, and now as executive director, that there's a real distrust and dislike of organizations. That's sort of this countercultural and maybe particularly boomer kind of rejection of the um, the powers that be. And um, I consider myself pretty radical, pretty political. Worked in a lot of social justice and social change um, movements and communities most of my life, but it's um, it's been interesting to hear sort of a backlash against any kind of organization, whereas I've really come at it as in my work and in my life as building a new kind of organization, a new way of working together. So for me, for people who are interested in social change, and I think that many people come to practice because they are interested not only in changing um, having some kind of transformation in their own life, but a transformation in the world, that we need organizations to do it. The original Sangha was an organization, and there were many rules and structures that the Buddha put in place for it to function well. And so I really see organization building as part of our process for creating strong, sustainable, healthy sanghas.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up that you're right. There's this sense of an aversion to any kind of organizational structure and a great interest in having a flat model where everyone has a say and there's a democratic process, and I'm in favor of that. But I've seen it to the point of groups that aren't even willing to take action to create a hub around which their particular interests lie because that would be an organization and therefore would be evil and bad, so we can't do that. And unfortunately, it hinders the change they're trying to accomplish in the world.
Yeah, so not so much organizational version, but this shift that's happening of sort of a changing of the guards, where a lot of organizations that were founded and directed by boomers and a previous generation being handed over and taken over by a newer generation, and just the culture clash and shift that's going on. And a lot of foundations and think tanks have been just looking at this shift because it's such a huge demographic shift. There were so many nonprofits and social profits that were created in the late 60s, early 70s, and going into the late 70s of people who were really just inspired by all of the social change that was happening at that time and looking to make a deep impact. But the kind of nonprofit management and organizational understanding grew with that. And a lot of the original leaders didn't necessarily catch up with that growth. Um, so you have a new generation of people who are coming in who have a really different understanding and appreciation for the power of organizations to really shape communities and in a way that's really positive and impactful, that we don't have to distrust it. We really have to honor it, actually, and pay it a lot of respect.
So how is it that you blend these interests? Does your Buddhist and meditative background help inform your understanding of organizational paradigms and what you want to do with them?
That's interesting. I don't know if I think about it in those terms, or in that way. Um, you know, definitely there's uh, my practice definitely influenced, and this is before I took this role, my sense of intention and motivation for my work, and it really coming from a deeper place, a sense of service to all beings. And um, I think that in terms of how it's influencing me here now at New York Insight, I've actually been really fortunate to step into a situation that's fairly healthy, um, in terms of the harmony amongst the original founders, three of whom are still very involved at the center, one who's our guiding teacher, another who's a teacher, and the other who's still on the board. All three are still on the board. And just it's not that there's always agreement, but the practice that's put into place, and I see it in terms of people not holding on so strongly to any one idea or opinion about how things should be going here, but really opening up to possibilities and allowing for multiple voices, and doing that in a way that's structured and not just wanting to be flat necessarily, but really allowing for a diversity of voices to come in and to allow the organization to grow into what it needs to grow into. And that's determined not only by the board, the teachers, but really the entire Sangha. So, there's definitely a lot of practice within that in regards to really seeing things clearly and really listening and being able to let go and to not holding on so tightly to any one idea.
Yeah, yeah. So tell us about New York Insight Meditation Center, how they're organized that may be a little different from a traditional Buddhist vihara. What are some of the mechanisms in place or the organizational paradigms that have been used there which help contribute to that openness you're talking about?
Well, it's interesting because with Vihara, there's the religious leadership, and that dictates so much. There's also the set rules and guidelines for practice and for participation. New York Insight, when it was founded by five people who just had a love of the practice and wanted to share the Dharma. And some of those people eventually became, well, four out of the five eventually became teachers within sort of the Insight tradition. So through some relationship to Spirit Rock and IMS, either the Community Dharma Leader Program or the Community Dharma Leader Program and teacher training. But we never had a guiding teacher until a couple of years ago. And in some ways, that was very challenging because there was a looseness to the organization that really led to some issues that are starting to be addressed because a couple of years ago, I think it's 2 years now, Gina Sharp became our guiding teacher, was voted in as guiding teacher by the board. And that's been a great boon to the community. But in some ways, the first 12 years or however many years of our development without a guiding teacher allowed us to coalesce into a community that had a lot of different voices, different leadership influencing people. And in addition, Gina stepped into the role as guiding teacher with very light touch, wanting to really foster a sense of community and sangha amongst the teachers themselves, and also honor this kind of collective experience the organization had been having. So it's very different than a single teacher founding an organization and being the face and head of the organization from the start. So it's just kind of serendipitous. It wasn't planned that way. In a lot of ways, it served the community that we didn't form and kind of We didn't start and grow around one particular person or personality from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine that foundational element of being a group effort helped because there wasn't anything to radically change in a particular person's guiding principles.
Exactly. Yeah. And there wasn't, one person um, dictating the course of the ship, so to speak.
So, what have you found to be some of the challenges with this model, and is it still evolving, do you think?
It's definitely evolving. Um, I've since I've come into this role, I try and communicate with other center leaders, be it retreat centers or urban Dharma centers, including outside the traditions. So I have a relationship with the New York Shambhala Meditation Center and the director there, just to understand what it is we're doing. I come from traditional nonprofit world where it's still evolving for many organizations, but there are protocols and understandings of how to kind of create sustainability and create a healthy organization. With Dharma centers, especially urban Dharma centers, most of them are struggling. It's really trying to understand how to make this viable and sustainable. We've sort of come at it from many different directions in terms of uh, fundraising and creating ongoing support for this operation. Um, but there's been also pushback on that. You know, we only moved into a space about 8 years ago, and for the first 7 or whatever years of New York Insight's existence, it was a wandering sangha, like many sanghas start out. So, renting space here and there for various events. Um, and recently, someone asked, why are we doing all this fundraising? Why can't we just go back to the way we were? And we could go back to that if that's what the majority of the sangha wants. But I don't think that that's a viable solution for an ongoing center that supports the practice and continues to offer these teachings beyond the original members. And so understanding how to do that is a lot of the exploration and the evolution that you were asking about. So one of the things that we've been sort of talking about and trying to understand is how much are we a community and how much are we a venue, especially being in a city like New York where the rents are very high. In order to even maintain the space, we need to have a certain number of large events or courses that can draw income to create that support for all the other programming we have, much of which is by donation and freely offered. And so uh, helping people understand that it's not about getting big. We have an intention of getting much bigger than we are in terms of staff size or resources, but just being able to maintain this um, is challenging, and it's a challenge that's faced by pretty much every organization I've talked to that doesn't have an endowment. And there are a couple, even insight centers that do have endowments, but if you don't have an endowment, how do you create sustainable organization?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I imagine in your role with your background, you have what may be a somewhat unique perspective from your cohorts at New York Insight, or maybe not. Maybe several of them have that kind of background. I know that some other centers which were started as nonprofits and were nonetheless entrenched in a particular religious tradition have struggled a bit with becoming more secularized to open it up to a wider community, folks who don't have a particular resonance with the cultural trappings in a very positive way. And honestly, for folks who are listening who may also have that dissonance with that, please consider getting past that because there's great benefit to these traditions as well. And my own progress on the path involved getting over some speed bumps and personal hurdles. And it seems that what they're struggling with now is, and this comes and goes in waves, is do they become more secularized to open it up, or do they really stay with being a traditional center? And one of the things that has come up as a point of discussion is there really any need to firmly establish themselves as one or the other? Can't they have two concomitant tracks and programs that would appeal to different segments of a local community? Have you run into any of that?
Definitely. So one of our on since I joined the board, I think in 2007 or eight, and the conversation, our mindfulness-based stress reduction, had been going on for a number of years already, and really didn't get resolved until this year when we offered our first MBSR class here. And we're fortunate that we have two New York Insight teachers who are, trained in the Insight Theravadan tradition, who are also trained MBSR teachers, and so it felt seamless to have them make those offerings here. But it was a real challenge to the board initially about sort of where we were going. And I think New York Insight particularly feels a responsibility, or we've talked about a feeling of responsibility for somewhat maintaining the space as offering primarily the Theravadan teachings. So, we do have Theravadan monastics who come through. We had one here this morning. And we do teach pretty much from the Pali Canon. Andrew Olensky, which is how I know Doug, from that course, has taught now a second year-long course, really teaching sutta study primarily. And so, there is a sense of being the one major center. There are other sanghas, including Dharmapungs and Downtown Meditation Community, who offer Theravadan teachings, but really being sort of the holder of that tradition in the city. And so there's a sense of responsibility for that. But we also, Anam Tupten is teaching here at the end of the month. We have sometimes some teachers from the village Zendo who teach here. So it's not about, sort of a doctrinal purity and closing everything else out, but really also not confusing students with a variety of teachings that our teachers might not be able to really hold themselves. But with MBSR and with sort of the more secularized mindfulness teachings, it's really, I think for us, has been a question of having teachers who we feel really embody the Dharma fully in terms of their understanding of the practices beyond mindfulness, and really coming to the role from a place of ethics and wisdom, being able to offer those teachings here too. If it's a window for people or a door for people to enter into the other things that we offer here, because we do offer not only meditation but all of the teachings of the Buddha, then that's great. And if the MBSR class helps someone, that's great too.
Yeah, it's a wonderful gateway, and there was a lot of discussion even on our own site about, is this a bad thing? Is this a watering down? And I realize these are the same kinds of criticisms that we get with a secularized Buddhism, is that, that's a watering down. And, well, no, we're not doing the tradition. We're doing something else, and these can run in parallel. And that I think an MBSR program, and having now been through the basic course, is a nice gateway for people. Although, as you'd mentioned, a key distinguishing characteristic that has come up that people from a more traditional background see as missing, and I think out of necessity to its background and constraint of being an 8-week program, they can't really go into Panya and Sila as well as Samatha. It's just focusing on one area. And to have that doorway opening nonetheless, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, I think so too.
So where I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this is what you find to be the most contributive to building inclusive communities, because you have a pretty good and robust background in that, and I'd really like to hear what you have to think about it.
Well, this is something that is really central to our work and has been a real challenge as well. So, one of the things that we're really looking at is being a center that really reflects the city. We are a New York Insight Meditation Center, and we look like we're a meditation center based in the Midwest, where maybe there isn't a lot of diversity. Then, we're doing something wrong. So we're very fortunate that we have Gina and that she's been such a leader in the conversation around diversity within, um, particularly the Insight tradition and at Spirit Rock, and IMS has been leading the people of color retreats for many years. I think over a decade now, and that's been a huge step for us just to have her as a teacher. Our people of color sitting group, which is once a month in our center, we have satellite sittings in Harlem and in Brooklyn that are led by other teachers. But the monthly sitting here with Gina is actually the largest ongoing sitting group at New York Insight. So it's a pretty large sized group, and it's very difficult to get people from that group to attend other events that aren't led by Gina. And I think part of the challenge of inclusivity is having inclusive leadership. So if you don't have a diverse leadership, people won't necessarily trust your, not necessarily intentions, but your commitment to that ideal
Mm-hmm,
or
mm-hmm,
goal. Beyond race, I think it leads to all sorts of other kind of conversations about what does inclusive mean. I think one of our biggest commitments is that we have an entirely open scholarship policy. So anyone, anytime can apply for a scholarship to an event. And we really want to honor that as much as possible. There's some events where we only have a limited number of scholarships just because the teacher is so popular, it would really challenge us to give away, half the room as a scholarship. But for as much as we can, we try and break down the barriers to access to the practice. So I think that's been another barrier, not only to racial diversity, but to economic diversity and to age diversity, when people are in fixed incomes. And so this practice, just as much as it's not only for middle class white people, um, it really doesn't look that way if retreats and events cost hundreds of dollars and people can't get to them. Mm. So that's been another commitment of ours that challenges us financially, obviously, because we have to make up for that somewhere else. Um, so I think that sort of understanding the barriers to practice and the barriers to inclusivity are the first key to then dismantling those barriers. So at New York Insight, we've been fortunate that Gina was also one of the leaders of the Community Dharma Leader Program that just finished at Spirit Rock in September, CDL4, which is the main training for community leaders who lead sitting groups and courses and non-residential retreats. And this CDL happened to be the most diverse in history and graduated a large number of teachers of color, of LGBTQ teachers, and we were very fortunate to have a number of graduates who are, including myself, who are all now teaching here, and then drawing younger people, people of color, and just a diversity of experiences and voices. Also being able to teach in neighborhoods maybe didn't have sitting groups before because none of the practice leaders or leaders were from those neighborhoods. So the diversity really has to be from both sides. It's not just who's sitting on the cushion, but also who's sitting on the dais.
Let's take a few minutes to share some of the programs you have at New York Insight Meditation Center. What are some of the things that you do on a regular basis, or some of the upcoming programs that you'd like to share?
I think one of the most exciting things we're doing, and I mentioned it briefly, is Andrew Olinsky's course from the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies has had a longstanding course called the Integrated Study and Practice Program that's taught by Andrew and Gloria Tarania Ambrosia. And they've adapted it because it's a multiple retreat course up in Barry, Massachusetts, usually. And how Andy's done it is that he comes down for one day a month and does a day long at New York Insight, and 4 times during the year, Gloria Tarnia will come here or comes here and does a day long on teaching. And so thematically going through sort of the foundational teachings of the Buddha as they're found in the Pali Canon, and largely by studying suttas. And then one of the things that has been challenging for, I think many Dharma centers are challenged with this, is that people want to go deeper and there aren't enough opportunities to do that because there aren't enough teachers, and the sort of model of sitting groups is always welcoming new practitioners. And so, you're coming to sitting after sitting, year after year, just sort of watching the breath. And you want to go deeper, but the teachers can't because they always need to sort of teach and again, I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, but to the lowest common denominator in the room. And so to have someone like Andy, who's such a deep scholar, and Gloria Terania, who's such a deep teacher, have this opportunity for, I think there are 115 people registered in this course. So for a year to go so deeply, and we work very interactively. Also during the day longs, there's a lot of discussion in small groups. There's buddy work throughout the year. So we have various buddies that we study with. And there's a source book with all the materials and sutta excerpts for study. That's been a really, really valuable, rich, and just fortunate experience for all of us. Something that we do that's not necessarily a program, but we're really looking at what it means to be an urban Dharma center, and that's different than a retreat center. A lot of the insight centers just modeled themselves off of IMS. IMS is definitely our mothership. We have a very strong relationship with them and doing a lot of our work actually around diversity and inclusivity in partnership with them and BCBS. But we aren't a retreat center. We're not here to kind of allow people to drop into something really deep and really give themselves a break from the outside world. We are in the outside world, and we're really grappling with how to practice in the midst of our lives. And so there's such a strong current in this tradition, and probably in all the Western Buddhist traditions, towards silence, towards interiority. And while we do have silent day longs and silent weekends and many opportunities for silent practice, we're also really engaged and exploring what it means to be in practice in our lives, in our daily lives with each other. So we do simple things like every event at New York Insight, we start with sort of a meet and greet, where before we go into a sitting, people are asked to introduce themselves to their neighbors and walk around and talk to each other and engage, so that we don't have that, I call it the back of the head sangha. You come in, you stare at the back of someone's head for 2 hours, a couple of bold people ask questions, then everybody leaves.
I know some people better by the back of their heads than they do by their faces for exactly that reason.
And and again, to honor the depth of practice, we really encourage, and we're lucky to have that relationship with IMS to encourage people to experience retreat practice, but to really recognize that what we're doing here is different, and in that way, we have a lot to learn from the Asian traditions, which are really engaged in community and Sangha being really a part of life. We call silent back of the head practice Sangha, but I think that in Thailand, they wouldn't recognize that as Sangha at all. They would be really confused by that.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. For folks who are listening to the podcast who want to find out more about New York Insight Meditation Center, their website address is www.nyimc.org. And I'll also have a link on the episode page to Sebene's personal website as well. Our guest today, Sebene Selassie. Sebene, thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Ted. It was great.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Tai Hei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.